On today's show, Mark Cuban shared in an interview that the Mavs were really close to pulling off a trade for Kobe Bryant. What if it actually happened? We're going to bring in another Mark Followill, the voice of the Mavericks, to break it all down on today's Locked On Mavs.
I'm Luka Doncic, and this is Locked On Mavericks podcast.
Hey, Dallas Mavericks are NBA champions. Bang! Bang! It's good!
And the Mavericks have won the game!
If you don't believe, you shouldn't be here.
And welcome. You are locked on to the Dallas Mavericks. My name is Nick Angstadt, media member and NBA channel manager for the Locked On Podcast Network. Thanks for making Locked On Mavs your first listen every day. We are free and available on all platforms, including YouTube. But the best way you can help us grow the show is to comment anything below. And also let us know. We're talking about the what if of Kobe and Dirk today. How many titles would Dirk and Kobe have won? Just let us know in the comments. You can just put a number. Not 2, not 3, not 4, whatever you want to say. Today's episode is brought to you by BetOnline. They have you covered this season, more props, odds, and lines than ever before. BetOnline, where the game starts. And joining me, multiple-time guest. You know him from anytime you've ever watched a Mavericks game, probably in your life for a lot of our listeners. The great Mark Followill. He's also calling FC Dallas games, all kinds of stuff. Mark Followill, what you got for me?
Nick, I got a lot for you. It's great to be on what is, and I mean this with all sincerity, the best Mavs podcast that is out there. And this comes from somebody who hosts a Mavs podcast.
Some take that route, and then Tim Cato takes the route of we're the only Dallas Mavericks podcast. That's what he says for his. He just
man, you guys love what you and Ike do, and so it's great to be back on. Call anytime. I love being on the show. And, I hope it's okay that your listeners know that we're recording this on Tuesday night. Is that okay to say to your listeners?
Oh, yeah.
We said it.
We'll pull the curtain way back.
Yeah. So cheers. We're having a homemade minty mojito tonight during the podcast. So very, very excited to be with you.
You're calling FC Dallas game. I saw a clip of you calling a goal, I think, that wasn't allowed or something it was like the fifth goal, and it was like it's like a huge deal. I haven't been to an FC Dallas game since I moved back. Give me the pitch and give our listeners the pitch for what the atmosphere is like there, because it's different. It's different than any other like DFW sporting event.
Well, what's different about it is, look, it's the only professional soccer team in town, of course. That's number one. Number two is that I think that, their marketing plan has been great this year. There's a new coach. There's new players. There's homegrown players like Jesus Ferreira who have really come into their own this year. And Jesus Ferreira is right in the middle of the golden boot race, that is, in Major League Soccer, to be the top goal scorer in the league. He's tied for third right now. A very, very good chance that Jesus Ferreira will be the starting forward for the United States men in the World Cup later this year in Qatar. So you've got a chance to see an integral part of the U.S. men's World Cup team in Qatar this year if you come out and see FC Dallas. Supporter culture is alive and well. There are great supporters groups out there. It's also a great place if a family wants to come to the game as well. So you can get whatever kind of atmosphere you want to have. And most importantly, as with anything, it's always better when the team is winning. And after a difficult season last year, Coach Nico Estevez has stepped in this year and helped the team turn around from being the third worst in the Western Conference last year to, as we speak right now, the third best in the Western Conference this year. Headed towards a playoff spot, hopefully, and then maybe doing a little bit of damage when they get there.
I have to ask, are the supporters still wearing scarves? Because last time I went, they do the scarves like they do like for European soccer teams. And I'm like, yeah, how are we doing this in the dead of summer?
I think that more than wearing them, they're holding them up.
You hold them, yeah.
So you grasp both ends of a scarf and you hold it skyward like that. So, I think that's a lot more of what you're seeing. But you see, they've got drums and music and chants and coordinated things at particular parts of the game. And I think the atmosphere really has been great for games this year. Not to say that it wasn't great in the past, but, they've been drawing more fans, whether that's marketing, whether that's team success, I don't know. But attendance is as high as I can recall it in the 11 years that I've been doing FC Dallas games, consistent attendance. Obviously, sometimes, every year you're going to have a few sellouts, but there's been more this year. And, it's just been a great atmosphere and the team is doing well and doing well at home. And got a big game on Wednesday night against Philadelphia Union, who's the best team in the Eastern Conference and the very best defensive team in Major League Soccer. So if they get a result tomorrow night, that would be great.
There you go. Couple of newsy things before we get to our big what if today.
Okay.
We know about opening night against the Suns. We know about Christmas Day against the Lakers. We know that Jalen Brunson's return is December 27th. We now know the big return of Boban, the much anticipated return of Boban, November 16th. So we learned that about the schedule. And the Mavericks also reportedly are signing Tyler Hall from the Knicks G League team. He was with the Westchester Knicks for the last 3 seasons. He shot 41% on threes over the 3 years, over 500 attempts. So the Mavericks will bring him in as a training camp spot, and we'll see what happens with him. But he seems to be a good shooter to be brought in. So yeah, we'll yeah, go ahead.
It seems to me like, Nick, what's happening that's kind of interesting, and I guess there was a report from Shams the other day about McKinley Wright, who had spent a little bit of time with the Minnesota Timberwolves, I believe, this year, played a handful of games for them. So I don't know that this is the case. I haven't really heard Nico or J-Kid address this, but the way things seem to be unfolding at this point is I wonder if they're going to have a competition for the last two-way spot over the course of training camp. I wonder if that's kind of what they're angling towards at this point. With Tyler Dorsey already having been one of the players signed to a two-way contract, Moses Wright, I still feel like has to be a candidate after he was on a two-way deal for the final 6 weeks of last season. But, nothing's really been reported about whether or not he's going to be in camp with the Mavs or anything like that after he had a couple of good games in Summer League. But it seems at this point that maybe some news will come out in a couple of days that completely disputes what I'm saying. And they sign somebody to actually do sign someone to one of the two-way deals. But the way it sort of seems like it's unfolding right now is perhaps there's going to be a competition for the last two-way spot during training camp.
You can break news on here if you want to, Mark Followill.
No,
okay.
I don't. I am absolutely, completely baselessly speculating at this point.
For sure.
So yeah, I'm basing it on what I guess the base of it is the fact that they haven't signed anyone to the other two-way spot, and that we've seen, a little bit of news here in the last few days about some training camp signings.
For sure. Speaking of baselessly speculating, let's talk about our big what if today. It's Mark Cuban was on with Bleacher Report's Taylor Rooks, does really great interviews all the time. She came to Dallas and did an interview with Mark Cuban. I think it's the whole thing. I think it's on the Bleacher Report app, but you have to find it in clips. I couldn't find the whole thing. It's on YouTube, different places, and everywhere. And Mark Cuban has talked about this throughout the years, but apparently in 2007, when Kobe Bryant was making his trade demand, he wanted to go to the Clippers, he wanted to go to the Bulls. The Mavericks were not really mentioned in there, but Mark Cuban came out and said, hey, we were the ones that almost made a deal happen for Kobe Bryant. It was ready to go. He said it was a done deal. Mark Cuban said he was doing Dancing with the Stars at the time, right. And he told some of the PAs, told some of the people working on the show that it was a done deal, that they were going to trade Josh Howard, Jason Terry, and a couple of firsts to the Lakers for Kobe Bryant to pair him with Dirk. It's one that just blows your mind because I can't imagine those two guys playing together. But go back to like those years that you were, there with the Mavs, like what would that team have been like, and what would you have thought if that Kobe Bryant trade like actually went down?
Oh, I think that would have elevated the profile of the Mavs in the NBA, number one. And of course, Kobe and Dirk would have been instant title contenders. So I'm looking at the team that finished the 2007 season. Josh Howard and Jason Terry, as you said, would have been part of the trade.
Yeah.
So if you trade for Kobe, I mean, as we're going to go through all of the what ifs of this particular possible scenario, Kobe, I think, always was a big fan of Jason Kidd. And I think that there was a push to trade for Jason Kidd with the Lakers, as a matter of fact. I think Kobe was trying to convince Laker brass to trade Andrew Bynum for Jason Kidd.
This was about the time that they did the Chris Paul, like they tried the Chris Paul deal and that didn't go through. Then they did the Pau Gasol deal. So like they were trying all kinds of stuff to make moves. And I think Jason Kidd, oh my gosh, at that time there was a Lakers Photoshop for everybody. There was a Kevin Garnett one that kept getting thrown around. There was a Jason Kidd one for sure that kept getting circled around. Coming up, how many titles would Kobe and Dirk have won together? What was their competition back then in 2007, 2008? We'll talk about that. But before we do, imagine this. You're hanging out with some friends, putting back a few drinks, and a few becomes a few too many. As the evening comes to an end, people start to head out, and you think of calling for a ride. You're like, I live nearby. I can drive slow enough. It's fine. I'm not that dizzy, all that. It's no big deal. What are the odds you get pulled over anyway? And even so, what's the worst that could happen? Your insurance could go up. You lose your license. You lose your job. You total your car. You kill someone. Everyone knows the risks of driving drunk. The results are tragic and often deadly. However, that still doesn't stop everyone from getting behind the wheel under the influence. That's why police officers are out there right now looking for impaired drivers on our roads to save lives. So, if you think you're okay to drive after a few drinks, think again. Play it safe and plan ahead to get a ride. It only takes one mistake to change your life or someone else's forever. Drive sober or get pulled over.
So that would have been the summer of 2007. And remember that the Mavs made the trade for Jason Kidd at the deadline in February of 2008. So would that have, would they have continued to pursue that? Or do the Mavericks say, okay, we want Devin Harris to be the guy that's going to ride shotgun along with Dirk and Kobe Bryant? What would have happened with Eric Dampier? I can't imagine that Kobe would have been able to deal with Eric Dampier very well and passes getting dropped and such.
He's like, I just did this.
Jerry Stackhouse was the sixth man of the 06-07 team. So I think that, he still would have had a role here. Devin George was with the Mavs in 06-07. He was obviously a former Laker, so he had a relationship with Kobe. So that probably would have solidified his place with the team even further. Because remember that Devin George later that year was part of the initial trade for Jason Kidd, but because he was on a one-year deal with no options, then he had the right to veto the trade. He had the right to say no to a trade because his bird rights would not have transferred to New Jersey.
Like what Nerlens Noel just had.
Yeah. So the initial trade included Devin George, and it got reported. Then all of a sudden there was this realization, Devin George can say no and is saying no to being traded. He doesn't want to be traded. So then remember, they had to rework the trade with Jason Kidd to involve the sign and trade of the then retired Keith Van Horn. And, that was obviously a really weird deal. But Devin George, I think that would have, Kobe had been here, that would have solidified his place with the team. And then the rest of the roster is Sagana Diop, Greg Buckner, Anthony Johnson was on the 06-07 team, Austin Crozier. Those are the kind of the players that you're looking at. And of course, JJ Barea, by the way, was a rookie on the 06-07 team, having only played 33 games. So obviously I think he would have stayed around, but I think that you would have had, the avenue to pursue signings of ring chasing veterans.
For sure.
I don't have a good example of anybody who was kind of in that mode at that particular time. But think about what your competition would have been, in the finals in that 3-year run before the Heatles were put together. And obviously the Mavs beat them in the 2011 finals. But you would have looked at the first iteration, I guess I should say, of the Paul Pierce, Ray Allen, Kevin Garnett Celtics, who beat the Lakers in the final that year. Then in 2009, the Lakers defeated Orlando. So if you get through the Western Conference, then you're playing an Orlando team that had Dwight Howard, Hedo Turkoglu, who was okay. I think he had maybe won Most Improved Player of the Year that particular season. They had Jameer Nelson, who had a really good season, but Jameer Nelson got hurt. He had a shoulder injury maybe right around the All-Star break, because I think he had been named to the All-Star game, but didn't actually play in it because of a pretty serious shoulder injury that he suffered right before the All-Star break. He came back and played in the finals, but he wasn't, the same player. So you had, if you had made it to the finals, you would have had to feel really good about beating a 2009 Orlando Magic team that would have been your competition. And then the Lakers won in 2010 against another iteration of the Celtics, that same Garnett, Pierce, Ray Allen, Kendrick Perkins, et cetera team. And that went 7 games. So, I think that it's hard to not envision, considering what you were dealing with in the West. I mean, if Kobe and Paul Gasol and Lamar Odom and that group were going to be able to make it through the Western Conference, then you would have to think a Dirk Kobe duo would make it through the Western Conference in a couple of those years, if not all 3, like the Lakers did in 08, 09, and 10. And I think if you look at who they would have played in the finals, I think you have to feel really good about the chance to win for sure the Orlando finals and maybe one of the 2 finals that you would go up against Boston. So I think that probably would have been a couple of titles if you'd put Dirk and Kobe together. It's hard to argue against it, in my opinion.
And I started to look through the Western Conference teams over those years too, to say, okay, well, what was their competition? You talked about it in the actual finals, they had made it. That first season, the 2007-08 season, was like Chris Paul, David West, Peja, and Tyson Chandler's Hornets. There was the still Tim Duncan, Manu Ginobili, Tony Parker with Michael Finley's Spurs. The Suns.
So if I remember correctly, those 2 teams faced each other in the second round in 08. and the Spurs beat the Hornets in the 7th game in New Orleans. The home team had won every game in that series, and then the Spurs won on the road in Game 7, and the Lakers beat the Spurs in the conference finals.
Yeah, the Hornets were like the 2 seed that year.
That's correct. Yeah, because they beat Dallas in the 2-7 matchup.
And then that Suns team of Nash, Amari, Sean Marion was still there, and Shaq was there for a brief time that season.
Yeah, that was the 2010 finals when the Lakers beat the 2010 Western Conference Finals, I should say. The Lakers beat the Suns, and I think that Ron Artest made a really big shot in one of those games, and then said in his post-game interview, he thanked his psychiatrist or something like that. I mean, he really did. He really did.
He passed. That was
and so remember who the Lakers beat in the 2009 Western Conference Finals. That was the team that had beat Dallas in the second round, the Carmelo Anthony,
Allen Iverson, Chauncey Billups.
No, I don't think Iverson was there. It was
the year before. The year before Iverson was there, but Chauncey Billups was
the
there.
2009 Nuggets were Melo, Kenyon Martin, Nene was on that team and was a really a key part of it. I can't remember who else was on that team, but those are the key figures that were on that team. And so that's who the Lakers beat in the 2009 Western Conference Finals. So I think to add a little bit more to the discussion, you would look at who the Lakers were facing with Kobe and Pau Gasol in 08, 9, and 10. And if you said, okay, it's Kobe and Dirk, then you would have to feel good about them getting through those teams and being in a position to be in the finals and win 1 or 2 championships.
They run the table. With these teams. I think you just look at some of the some of their competition. And once you get to 2011, that's when the Mavs obviously made their run. Like, you still have that Spurs team. You have the really young Thunder team that with KD and Westbrook and Harden. And then the only other teams in that season in the West with 50 wins were the Mavs and the Lakers, and that team would have been fused into one with this hypothetical. Right. So it's hard to not imagine them making all 4 finals, at least all 4 finals, because the Lakers, instead of making this trade, and this is the part of the Mark Cuban story that changes throughout the year. I read several different iterations of this story, like the ESPN one from a couple years ago. There was one with JJ Redick 2 years ago. Then there was this one with Bleacher Report, and Mark Cuban in different instances said that either Jerry Buss, Jerry West, or Mitch Kupchak, after Kobe Bryant, they made this trade and they had this deal done, that one of those 3 figures, which are the big figures with the Lakers, it was Jerry West is obviously a legend, was a consultant there at the time. Jerry Buss, the owner. Mitch Kupchak was the GM at the time. One of those guys talked Kobe out of this whole thing, talked him out of the whole thing, the trade to the Clippers, the trade to the Bulls, or this trade to the Mavericks, apparently, that had gone through. And I just find that interesting that it was one of those guys that called him and convinced him. But then the Lakers actually then trade for Pau Gasol. They make the next 3 finals and win 2 of them. They made
the trade at approaching the deadline when the Mavericks made the Jason Kidd trade at the 2008 trade deadline. I think a couple of weeks before that, Pau Gasol had been traded to the Lakers. And as I recall, and maybe you can look this up, Nick, or one of us can look it up, but I think that the NBA world was very pissed off about that Pau Gasol trade.
Oh, for sure.
Because it was very one-sided. I mean, the Lakers sent very little in terms of meaningful talent out towards Memphis at that point in time.
My young self was a very big Lakers fan, and having been born in LA, and I remember that trade very vividly. Yeah, it was was
it Kwame Brown? Maybe
they sent Kwame Brown was the main player. They sent Javaris Crittenton in it, who now is infamous for the Wizards gun in the locker room situation.
Right.
But Marc Gasol was in it, but nobody knew who Marc Gasol was. He was Pau's brother, and they were switching places, but he was chunky, not going to be very good, 50th pick in the draft, Marc Gasol.
Yeah, exactly.
And the Aaron McKee, who was their point guard, who had been good a while ago, and then 2 picks. It was 2 firsts, and that was it. And everyone was how did they pull off this deal? And how did the Lakers do it again? It was just all that eye rolling, and kind of the same eye rolling that happened with the Kevin Durant to the Warriors thing. And that is maybe going to happen again, but we'll see.
Yeah. So I think that, there's little doubt in my mind that Maverick team, it would be interesting to know, again, what the personnel would have looked like. Does Devin Harris stay here? Do you pursue Jason Kidd in a trade? What other player acquisition avenues open up, because you would get ring chasing veterans? But I think that the other thing about it, when you think about it, is look at the other domino effects that might have had. Okay, so Kobe gets here. Does Avery, Avery was the coach.
Yeah.
Would Avery have stayed on if they had a year where they didn't win and they had to make a coaching change? Would Rick Carlisle have been the choice? Could you see Rick and Kobe Bryant coexisting? Would that have been something that would have worked? If you don't trade for Jason Kidd, then you don't establish the long-term relationship. And so would Jason Kidd in 2022 even be the coach of the Mavericks if you had done that trade, and depending on how they would have approached Jason Kidd as a potential player acquisition back in 2007, 2008. So I think the amazing thing about it is the other domino effects that could have happened.
Coming up, we'll continue our what if on Kobe Bryant with Dirk Nowitzki. What would happen to the coaches? What would happen to Kobe and Dirk's legacy, their career? And then we'll also talk about Kobe Bryant's trade request. It was wild, even more wild than the Durant one or any of the other ones we've seen recently. We'll talk about that coming up. But before we do, let me tell you about BetOnline. It is the best place to check out the odds and lines in sports. You can go check it out right now. They have Mavs odds. They have everything that you would want for the upcoming season. They're even going to have Eurobasket. Eurobasket coming up right now. They have it. They have group. Odds to win Eurobasket. Just the odds overall. Serbia, plus 350. Slovenia, let's go. Mi Slovenci, plus 400. They're number 2 right now, and Greece is plus 450. France, plus 550. Spain, plus 900. So Slovenia, the number 2 odds to win Eurobasket, according to BetOnline. You can also check out the Group B winner. Slovenia's plus 125 to win that, with France at 185 right after them. You can also bet on the WNBA. Our Dallas Wings the Sun are a minus 800 favorite. That's not the biggest odds. The Aces are a minus 2,500 favorite, but the Sun are a series favorite against the Wings. The Wings, you can put down $100. You can win 580 on the Wings. So go check it out. It's BetOnline. It's where the game starts.
And the other thing too is at that point, if you win a couple of titles, okay, so then what does, and then if the team starts to, as all dynasties do, if you start to kind of like go downhill a little bit, what does Kobe do? Does Kobe want to retire as a Maverick? Or does he say, I still want to keep ring chasing and we can't win here, so, move me on to the next place? That would have been really, one of the great things that we admire about Dirk and Kobe were that they were one-team guys for the duration of their career. How would we look back at the legacy of Kobe Bryant if he had been traded to Dallas? And, I mean, look, if you win titles, I think that's the bottom line. I mean, that's what you're chasing in this business. So maybe it wouldn't have been that big of a thing in terms of his legacy, but it might have. I don't know. But there are just, beyond just how many titles would the Mavericks have won, if in fact they would have, and I think we're both in agreement they would have. The other offshoots of that in terms of how it affects Avery, Rick, Jason Kidd. If you don't win a championship the first year and you change the coach, do you have to change Donnie Nelson? You end up having to make, because there would be so much pressure. And if you came short, God forbid, if you didn't even make the finals, if you had lost in the conference finals, and think of the pressure and think of the moves that the Mavs might have had to make from a front office perspective. So it could have had, cataclysmic impacts throughout the organization if they had made that trade and let's say it gotten off on the wrong foot.
It's interesting to me to look back and think about like Dirk's legacy in all this. Like if Dirk had it, because Kobe would have joined Dirk, so it would have kind of been like a weird LeBron joining Wade. Like it would have been that type of situation. And Dirk didn't have a title yet. That 2011 title is just so revered by so many people. Not just even Mavs fans, like outside of Mavs fans, people look at that as like, that's the perfect title. There may not be another title out there that is as perfect as that run and that win for Dirk with his legacy. Like if you're planning a Hollywood movie about Dirk's story, about how they lose in 06 and then the 07, and then he goes to the outback in Australia with his trainer and comes back a new man, like all that stuff comes back and you don't think he's going to win it. And then 2011, they beat the best team that had ever been assembled. Like it's just such a Hollywood story, and I wonder how we would have looked back at Dirk's career if he would have won probably 2-3 titles, but he wouldn't have that one where he won it. Like he was the one superstar on that team that won it.
Well, ever since we texted today and said that we were going to talk about this, I have thought about that very aspect of it a lot. And I think, see, the thing about it is this, is we wouldn't have had the knowledge of what that perfect title would be like. You know, we think about it because we know what it was like. And so we revere it so much.
For sure.
And let's face it, it was, as you said, the perfect title. And, you know, we look back at it and it's just such a treasured memory. And it's probably better. I mean, it's better than having won it the other way. But I think at the time, if you put yourself back into the 2007 Maverick fan, team, personnel, employee mindset of heartbreaking 06 finals loss, the disaster of what happened against Golden State in 07, I think at that point, you're just so hungry for a championship that, you know, especially since you wouldn't have had the other championship to kind of compare it to and have the knowledge of it. I think everybody would have been just so relieved and excited to win a title that I don't know that it changes legacies a whole lot. You know, we only have this great thing to compare it to of Dirk finally getting over the hump in 2011 and doing it the quote unquote right way. Yeah. But I think the bottom line is, you get into this league and you're pursuing, when you're an elite player, you're pursuing winning championships. And to me, it's hard to kind of really ever have a championship legacy that is tarnished or substandard or whatever description or adjective you might want to put on it. So it all worked out for the best because Kobe stayed with one team for his career and won multiple titles, and Dirk stayed with one team for his career and won that perfect title in 2011. But I don't think any of us would be like crying in our minty mojito if Kobe had been traded here and the Mavericks had won 2 titles in 2009 and 2010 that way.
Yeah, and you think, some people say like, oh, that 2011 title counts as like 2 titles. You consider it like it has that much weight if you were going to weigh titles. I think Bill Simmons has the thing where he says the MVP trophy should weigh a certain amount for how much it means, right? Like it should be a 50-pound trophy, a 10-pound trophy. Like maybe the 2011 weighs a little bit more in those. And if they win 2 or 3 titles, that it would have equaled out in Dirk's legacy. So yeah, it may have just like all worked out the same. The thing.
Well, here's what I always say to people about titles. The difference between 2 titles and 1 title is not remotely comparable to the difference that exists between 1 title and no titles.
None.
Yeah. So
ask Charles Barkley.
Yeah. So 2 would have been great. You know, I don't know that I don't know that I necessarily agree with Bill Simmons and that 1 counts for 2 or anything like that. It's like, you've won. And when you've won 1, you know, I mean, look, it's great to win 4 and 5 and 6, obviously. And the late, great Bill Russell, you know, who is on our minds right now, having won 11 and being the ultimate winner. But the bottom line is you win 1 and that changes the entire narrative about your career, everything about your legacy, everything about how people look at you in terms of your contributions to the game. So, you know, I don't know that I count 1 as more than just 1, but the bottom line is winning 1 is a complete and total game changer in terms of the perception of your career.
The other thing I thought about in all this is the relationship between Kobe and Pau was so contested at certain times where like Pau had this kind of the same thing as Dirk, where it was he's the soft European guy. Can he win at the highest level? Can he do it? And that would have been the narrative with Dirk if they had made this trade, because his MVP wouldn't have happened yet, or yeah, no, he had his MVP year.
Yeah, the MVP
lost in the first round. So it would have just been he can't get over the hump. You know, he's soft. I think that Kobe would have had just a little bit more respect for Dirk coming in, and I wonder if that would have helped in this whole thing, because Dirk was a more accomplished player. I don't know if Kobe had the respect for Dirk yet, because obviously there's so many quotes about Dirk from Kobe. And then there's the clip where Dirk hits that shot right in front of Kobe on the bench when he like points at him and is like, that guy right there. Like, I don't know if that had happened yet, but I wonder how that would have worked out. And it eventually all worked out with him and Pau, but I wonder how him and Dirk would have played out as a duo.
I think that given Kobe, you know, I was never around Kobe. All I can tell you is what people have told me. is that Kobe, of course, was a relentless, tireless worker. And as we know, Nick, Dirk was a relentless, tireless, indefatigable worker, when it came to his approach to the game. So I think that Kobe would have, once he got here, if he didn't already know it, once he got here and saw it, I think that would have cemented a really good bond between the two of them, because Kobe was just such an animal when it came to work ethic and working on his game. And I think that he would have had instant respect once he got here and saw that Dirk's approach was essentially the same thing. And, I don't know, I wasn't around. I think Powell was a great worker as well. I was never around him day to day to know, and who knows if that was any part of their contentiousness as you described it. But, the bottom line is Powell could play and got the job done and, came through in a lot of big moments for the Lakers during those titles in 2009 and 2010.
It was, from what I remember, it was never about like the Powell didn't work. Like it wasn't like the Kobe Shaq thing. It was more like Kobe just had such a high like bar that he would call for players. Like he learned from Michael Jordan, right? And Michael Jordan would call people to such a high level that anytime Powell was in the wrong spot or the wrong spot that Kobe thought was the wrong spot, they would get into it and there would be a look that Kobe shot him. And it just would have been interesting to see.
Well, when things started to kind of trend down for the Lakers, so I guess this would have been the 2012-13 season. This would have been, Powell was still there and they brought Nash and Dwight Howard on. And,
this will be fun.
That whole season.
It was not.
But wasn't there one point at time in that year when they were struggling and Powell Gasol was talking about their struggles and the difficulties of it and all the challenges that he felt like that they were facing. And Kobe said in the media that we need to stop crying and put our big boy pants on. I believe there was something.
Yes.
Kobe, somebody used the term, we need to put our big boy pants on. And I thought that was Kobe talking about something that Powell had said about all the difficulties that they were having.
Oh, yeah.
And so, of course, the funny thing that happened with that is our good friend down in Houston. I don't know if you've ever had Craig Ackerman on any of your podcasts before. Craig Ackerman at the time was the radio voice of the Rockets. And now, since Bill Worrell is retired, Craig is the television voice of the Rockets and does a fantastic job and is very, very talented. Consider him a good friend. And I happened to listen like right after that quote had happened. The Rockets were playing a home game against the Lakers, and the Lakers got down there and it was a very close game. And I think maybe the Lakers kind of actually blew it in the last minute. It was a game that looked like they were about to win and they ended up blowing it. Houston won. And right after that big boy pants quote came out, Craig Ackerman on the Houston Rockets broadcast said after Houston kind of improbably won this game, and the Lakers just pooped their big boy pants. And I was like, man, that is a hell of a call for NBA radio right there. I like it. That's very impressive. So
the last thing that stood out to me in this was, well, there's a million things, but the one thing I want to share was how public Kobe's trade request was. Like, there's a lot of people right now they're talking about the Kevin Durant trade request and all these guys. Andre Iguodala just had a quote recently, like, "Hey, you should just buck up and go and play there. Like, you decided to go there and like, make it happen." And people talk about, oh, there's just these trade requests and guys just want to leave all the time and can't they? Kobe went on Stephen A. Smith's radio show in New York.
I don't remember the circumstances of the trade request, so I'm excited to hear this.
So that it had been circulating around, and Kobe went on Stephen A. Smith's show, like his New York radio show, and said, "I quote, I would like to be traded. Yeah, tough as it is to come to that conclusion, there's no other alternative, you know." You imagine if Kevin Durant did that? Like, he goes on JJ Redick's podcast and is like, "Yeah, I'd like to be traded," like that, and then like later, a couple days later, I think he goes on Dan Patrick's show on ESPN. And he walks it back because between the interview with Stephen A. Smith and Dan Patrick, he had talked to Phil Jackson, that's the coach of the Lakers at that point. Sure. And he had like talked him back from that. But I just found that quote on a radio show like that so interesting because.
So at that point in time, I don't recall, you get fined now. If you make a trade request public, players are fined for doing that. And I wonder, I guess maybe we hadn't reached that place where the league was, finding players for public trade requests. I don't know, but I wonder, that's another thing that sort of changed the dynamic of that. Now, in the case of Durant, he's never publicly made a trade request. This has all been that, reports that this is what he said behind the scenes.
Yeah, not on his own.
Yeah, he hasn't gone out on JJ Redick's podcast or his own podcast or Draymond's podcast or whatever. Or Locked On Warriors or Locked On Mavs.
Oh my God.
Locked On Nets, whatever.
Kevin Durant went on Draymond Green's podcast and demanded a trade, it would break everything, I think. That would
would break Twitter.
Oh my goodness.
If he did that. So I think that's obviously a little bit of the different thing that's happening these days is that, people now know that you can't make public trade requests or you can't even have your representation make a trade request publicly. Can they do it privately? Sure, they can, but publicly a trade request results in a fine now. So that's something that sort of changes the dynamic with it a little bit more compared to what Kobe was doing in 2007.
This is a fascinating what if. It breaks my brain a little bit. It all worked out in the end, I think, for both parties. Kobe wins a couple titles. Dirk wins his title. But what could have been? What could have been if they had been traded and been together?
And it's just, like I said earlier, to me, it's not just about the titles, but it's about all of the other ancillary effects. What players come here, what players get, beyond Jason Terry and Josh Howard, who were the two people that Mark has said over the years that would have been the players traded to the Lakers. I mean, by the way, what would that have meant for their careers, respectively? And how would that have changed positively or negatively their career arc? But what happens with other players? Like I said, would ring chasing veterans? I think they would have. What kind of ring chasing veterans would have come upon the scene here in Dallas? What would have happened with the coaching situation? If you make a change, who's the person that gets brought in? Does Phil Jackson end up here? I mean, what could have happened in the front office? As I said earlier, if you trade for Jason Kidd, maybe you still trade for Jason Kidd because Kobe liked him. But if you don't, then, 15 years later, is Jason Kidd even here because of the relationship that he ended up cultivating here in his time? I mean, it just has so many other potential ancillary effects just beyond the debate of winning a championship that it makes for an endlessly delicious hypothetical to discuss.
Oh yeah, and we'll do it as many times over the years as we can on this show.
As long as it keeps getting brought up, then why not?
He's Mark Followill. You can listen to him on the FC Dallas broadcast right now, and of course, when Mavs basketball comes back in like 2 months, right? September, October, 2 months.
Yeah, we're just over 2 months away. So 2 months, a handful of days away from it getting started, and obviously very, very excited about it. It's been an interesting off season. Some good as we know, some not so good as we know, and I just did another podcast tonight, Nick, and I said, this is a really interesting offseason in the league because most of the time by August the 16th, as we record this, business is done around the league. But there's still this sort of specter of what's going to happen with Durant, what sort of domino effects will result if Brooklyn ends up trading Durant, where does he go, and what other moves end up happening because of that. And then you have the Donovan Mitchell situation. And if Donovan Mitchell gets moved to New York, then of course we would have to assume at that point that makes instantaneously Bogdanovich, Clarkson, Beverly, Conley, if those players aren't already available, if you trade Donovan Mitchell, if you're Utah, then surely all of those players are within the snap of a finger. They're available.
For sure.
So
for sure.
There's, and the Mavericks look, not that they're going to get in on Mitchell or Durant, but certainly if other dominoes start falling because of those trades, then I still think that there's a real chance to improve the team in that regard. I mean, look, at this point, trades are the only way that they can meaningfully change the team because the free agents are off the market. They don't have anything other than signing guys to a minimum. So at this point, trades are it. So that's still something that's kind of like lurking out there. That's something that could change the calculus of how we look at the good and the bad so far the Mavs all season.
Oh, it's what we're sitting here waiting for. We've been waiting for what's the next move? What's the next move? We've been waiting on it too long. We'll see if it happens before the season starts. Mark Followill, thank you so much for joining us.
You got it, Nick. Can't wait to be back on again.